One of the hardest things to master when we're first getting started with watercolor are paint consistencies and really understanding how different paint to water ratios for those paint mixtures that we have on our mixing palettes, those ratios are going to have a huge impact on how the paint reacts when it is placed on paper. It is incredibly important that we learn about these paint consistencies in the beginning of our journeys and do practice exercises so that we can set ourselves up for greater success. And in the beginning, we have to be a little bit more mindful when we're creating our color mixtures. But I promise you that as you continue practicing in time, you're going to be shifting these paint to water ratios as you're working intuitively and without thinking about it too much. In today's video, I'm going to be explaining about the tea to butter consistency method or learning approach. And this is a method made famous by world-renowned watercolor artist Joseph Zbukvic. So let's go ahead and jump in, and I would highly recommend practicing these exercises alongside me so that you can start developing that water control. And as I move along, I'm going to be providing some examples of how I personally like using these consistencies in my own painting processes. All right, let's jump in. So let's start with the tea to butter consistency, which is just one of the many methods that we can use, especially as beginners, to understand how different paint consistencies work. I would recommend choosing a darker color when you're working on these exercises, especially this first one where we're creating 5 different values using the same paint color. And this is because a darker color is going to allow you to develop a greater range of values than a lighter paint color. So what I am using right now is indigo, which is a very dark blue. And just as an FYI, I'm using a pretty large round brush so that I can load up my paintbrush bristles well and paint in these shapes that I've created nice and quick. So starting at the top with tea. This is the most watered down consistency that you're going to be using when painting with watercolor. I want you to think of the consistency of tea, not a chai tea or the kind of tea where you add a lot of cream and milk and sugar to it and it thickens up the tea. Just basic tea with water and a tea bag. With that consistency of tea in mind, I want you to bring out some of that paint color that you've chosen onto your mixing area, add water into it from your container, and mix it in well until it resembles that tea consistency. It's going to look very watered down on your mixing palette, and there's going to be a lot of movement because of the large amount of water that you've added in. Now, I really dislike numbers and math, and oftentimes when people bring in things like ratios and percentages and things like that into explanations, I kind of tune out. And I am the kind of person that enjoys learning through my 5 senses. I like seeing what is going on my palette, observing the change in value and texture, and feeling the difference between using watered down paint and thicker paint. And that is how I personally learn. If I had to go by exact ratios and percentages when I'm creating my color mixtures, that would be way too stressful. That would involve too much of my analytical brain. And honestly, it's not how we actually paint later on. If you need numbers, then when it comes to tea, I would say think of 90% water, 10% paint, roughly around that. Now, when is this tea consistency used? So usually when we're working with watercolor, we're making our way from lights to darks. Those techniques that require larger amounts of water and those color mixtures that have most water in them are used in the beginning of the painting process to allow us to create those lighter values, and then we make our way incrementally and gradually toward those darkest values or tones to develop that level of depth that we're after. So in other words, those tea consistencies are going to be used mostly in the beginning of the process, and you're going to be thickening up that paint as you make your way through the process and into the darker values or tones. Of course, this isn't to say that you cannot use glazing techniques, which certainly involves bringing in relatively watered down paint even in later stages of the process. But generally speaking, for the most part, those watered down paint colors are going to be used in the beginning of the process. Right here, I am painting some blueberries, and as you can see, I'm starting out with a very, very light, pale, watered down blue color, and I'm going to start building on that color by adding more of that same blue into my mixture, thickening up that paint, and dropping in more color to start developing those darker midtones. And for this painting, I am starting on dry paper. I'm going in wet on dry. But you can still use a watered down paint color on pre-wetted paper and work wet into wet. And I will be talking more about how to use different consistencies on both dry and wet paper later on in this video. And now let's move on to coffee. Bring the consistency of coffee to mind. Again, not coffee that is full of thick milk and tons of sugar. Think just of a basic, rich coffee with maybe just a tiny bit of milk in it. And then do your best to create a consistency that resembles that using the paint color that you've chosen. Now, again, if you were to ask me, well, what percentages are we talking about here? I would say roughly when it comes to coffee, it's around 30% paint and 70% water. When you see this consistency on your palette, it's going to look relatively watered down. There's going to be plenty of movement, but not as much as with the tea consistency. And as you can see, as I am painting in this rectangle, the value of this blue appears darker. And this is one of the cool things about watercolor is that you can create a whole bunch of different values or tones using just one same paint color. Of course, as you're developing a full painting, you will be mixing colors together if you're going for more believable results, because you'll want to desaturate colors to different degrees, and you'll want to develop a nice range of both hue and value as you're painting to make things look more realistic if that is your thing. However, one of the particularities of this medium is that by just adding more water and thinning down your color, or adding more paint and thickening up your color, you can create darker or lighter values. All right, so let's move on to the milk consistency, which is the middle of the range consistency here. I want you to bring the consistency of standard milk to mind, not the watered down 2% skim milk kind of milk. Regular full fat milk. When it comes to milk, I would say it's around 50% water, 50% paint at this point. And when you see this consistency on your color mixing palette, you will definitely see some movement, but not as much as with coffee or tea. I painted in this rectangle, and as you can see, my value of my blue looks a lot darker. As you continue working on changing the consistencies of your color mixtures on your palette, really observe the amount of movement that is going on. And you can even tilt your palette sideways or up and down to see how much movement is taking place. As you get thicker and thicker and into the milk, heavy cream, and butter consistencies, you want less and less movement. But also notice how it feels when you load up those paintbrush bristles, and as you're painting in that color into that square or rectangle that you've created for yourself, those are going to feel different as well. Okay, so now that we've talked about coffee and milk, let me explain a couple of situations where I would use these consistencies in a painting process. So for this rose piece, I use the pre-wetting technique, which simply means that I'm going in and doing pre-wetting with clean water, and once I've arrived at that nice even sheen, I then go ahead and start developing my first layer of color, which are my lighter values. Now, when I do pre-wetting, because there is already some amount of water on my paper, which is going to dilute and thin down my color even more, I don't go in with a tea consistency because that color is going to look too pale. So I go in with sometimes a coffee consistency, sometimes even a milk consistency since the beginning, because I know that that water on my paper is going to be added to the water content in my mixture, which is going to pale down my color even more. And plus, Watercolor is always going to dry lighter than how it looks when it's wet, so that's also something I'm anticipating. So I'm going in relatively thick since the beginning with a coffee to milk consistency. You can see me starting to apply this pink all throughout my rows. And then after I've developed those lightest values, I add even more of this red paint color into my mixture, thickening up my color, which at this point would be a milk consistency for sure. And I start dropping in this thicker version of my red into darker shadow shapes in between petals. After doing that wet on wet work in that first layer, I allowed everything to dry completely, and you can see how light this color looks after everything has dried. So at that point, I'm now thinking of developing midtones. So I'm going in on dry paper now. I'm continuing to use a milk consistency because I'm now working on darker midtones, and I'm placing this milk consistency paint only in shadow areas that I'm looking to darken. All right, let's move on to cream. And this can be difficult to visualize just because there are so many different types of cream. But I like to think of thicker, heavy cream when I am thinking of this consistency. For this one, think of mixing around 30% water with 70% paint. And when you see this color mixture on your palette, there's going to be some amount of movement if you really tilt your color mixing palette, but not nearly as close as with the previous ones. And as you can see, as I fill in this rectangle, the color gets even darker. And finally, there is butter. Butter would be 10% water, just enough for you to be able to load up your brush with some amount of that color and to be able to paint, but it is 90% paint, 10% water, very, very little movement going on my palette. And for those of you using watercolor tubes and using fresh paint straight out of the tube as you're painting, this is most likely the consistency that paint is going to have when you squeeze it out of that tube. Of course, the consistencies will vary a bit from brand to brand, and it also depends how old that paint is in that tube and if there is any air getting into that tube that will also affect the paint's consistency, but this is just generally speaking. As you can see, it's hard to fill in this rectangle because the paint is so quote-unquote dry. I'm creating a lot of dry brushing because I'm not able to smooth on that paint and create a uniform look. Most of the time when it comes to my own painting processes, I finish my paintings with the cream consistency, and I rarely use the butter consistency, to be honest. Sometimes I do, just to add a little bit of final textures at the end with dry brushing or other types of techniques, but many times I don't think it's necessary to arrive at that wide range of values that I need and that contrast that I need for realism. I am finishing this rose painting, for example, with a cream consistency. At this point, I am only looking to layer on that paint in the darkest areas that I'm looking to push contrast in even more. So I'm just going in with that darkest color mixture in a cream consistency in those areas that I'm really looking to push those darkest shadow shapes in. In other words, the thicker and thicker I get with my consistencies, the smaller the shapes that I paint in. If I were to explain this in a different way, 80 to 90% of my painting process is done with a tea to milk consistency, and then just the final bit is done with the cream consistency. Okay, so right here, a little time has passed and all of these swatches are completely dry at this point. So you can see those differences in value or tone as I make my way from tea to coffee to milk to cream and finally to butter. It is important that you take time to explore applying these different consistencies on both wet paper and dry paper because honestly, full watercolor paintings are created by combining wet on wet and wet on dry techniques. This is how we arrive at well-balanced results. at that beautiful combination of soft, diffused effects in some areas of our painting and sharper, more defined effects in other areas. This creates more depth and interest in your watercolor painting. So we need to know how to do both wet on wet and wet on dry. So what I did was I pre-wetted this upper rectangle with water from my container. And I made sure to take my time with the pre-wetting process, making sure that I arrived at a nice even sheen before dropping in my paint. I decided to go with alizarin crimson, which is a cool red, for these exercises. And first, I am going in with a tea consistency of this alizarin crimson. So you can see how, because there is a huge amount of water in that tea consistency color mixture on my palette, and that large amount of water is added onto that pre-wetted paper, which already has water on it, I end up with a ton of movement, a ton of beading, even pooling in some areas, and I need to remove that excess water because I'm losing control. I used the bristles of my paintbrush as a little absorbent sponge and touched the bristles of my paintbrush onto my absorbent towel to remove that excess paint/water that I had on my paper. But that was so much water, everything started dispersing and moving so fast that I ended up pretty much with a flat wash. So what I'm doing now is I'm adding more alizarin crimson into my color mixture, thickening up that paint even more. And now I would say I'm going in with more of a milk consistency. And you can see how I'm dropping in that color, and that paint is moving around a lot less because that color mixture has less water in it. So when I tilt my paper, that paint is dispersing a little bit, but not nearly as much as it was before. Now, of course, as you allow that paint and water to settle on your paper for a little bit longer, that paint is also going to move around less because that water is slowly absorbing into that paper. The drier your paper is, the less movement and expanding you're going to see. So it's not only how much water you have in your color mixtures, but how much water is sitting on your paper already as you're painting in your color. And the more you continue painting with watercolor, the more practice you get in, the easier it gets for you to tell when your paper is too wet or too dry for the types of effects that you're looking to create. All right, so in this bottom rectangle, I also did my pre-wetting with clean water, but now I am dropping in milk consistency paint on that wetness, and I want you to notice the huge difference between what is going on here when you compare this to what happened before when I dropped in the super watery color mixture. This paint does not move around and disperse nearly as much as the tea consistency did. And the thicker and thicker the paint, the less movement happens, and of course the darker that value looks. And as I allow that paint and that water to settle on that paper for a little bit longer, you're going to notice that that paint disperses and moves around even less as that paper gets closer and closer to drying completely. Those edges are still pretty soft, pretty diffused because this paper is still wet, but that paint is not expanding and moving nearly as much. And this is a great way to start exploring those different levels of wetness of your paper. But as I tilt this paper, you can see how there's still that even glistening look, which tells me that the paint is still wet and workable. The moment that that paper starts to dry, I wouldn't be trying to do very much at all because that's likely only going to lead to splotchiness, textures, and undesired effects. All right, and lastly, I want to show you how I like to develop a nice range of values to arrive at believable depth when using wet on wet and when using wet on dry. As I said before, when you're working on complete pieces, you're likely going to be using a combination of both techniques. But I want to show you how you're able to create a nice range of values using both, and more specifically, how to layer on color when you're using both techniques. So in this first rectangle, I've done pre-wetting because I want to show you how to do this wet into wet. I'm going to be using a purple color mixture that I've created by mixing together alizarin crimson and Prussian blue. So what I did was I pre-wetted this entire upper rectangle, and I started dropping in this purple color mixture. This is, I would say, a coffee consistency initially. And then I added in a little bit more of my two paint colors into that mixture to thicken up the mixture even more. And now I'm going in with more of a milk or almost cream consistency to darken certain areas over that. So you can see how I've arrived at a graded look here where I have some of that paper shining through, uncovered in some areas. Then I have other areas which look like a lighter purple where I just have that coffee consistency paint shining through. And then I developed an even darker purple in certain areas here and there where I went in with the milk consistency. And now I'm going to be filling in the wet on dry rectangle. So I'm going in on paper that is completely dry. And in these cases, it is important that I initially go in with a very, very light or the lightest, palest color so that I can develop darker values on this lightest color. Because if I go in right off the bat with a very thick, dark consistency, I am going to miss those lighter values that I need to arrive at believable depth and dimension and results that glow. And everything is going to look too dark and too heavy. So I start with the lightest, palest color, which is achieved with a tea consistency. I loaded up my paintbrush with a good amount of that tea consistency purple. I painted that in nice and quick, and I allowed that to dry completely. And now I'm going to show you how I would do layering to continue developing darker values in each of these cases. First, let's start with the wet on wet. And I did make sure to change my water because I want to do my pre-wetting with clean water. If I go in with water that looks murky, I can end up covering up those highlight areas and flattening everything out. You definitely want to do your pre-wetting gently and avoid doing any amount of scrubbing when you already have color dry on your paper and you don't want to mess that up. Once I arrived at that nice even sheen all throughout this upper rectangle, I can then go in with a thicker consistency, maybe a milk consistency or a cream consistency, and I drop that into areas that I'm looking to push contrast in even more. This expands that range of values that I'm creating, which enhances that sensation of depth, and because I'm working wet into wet, I'm still arriving at those very soft, diffused effects. And now let me explain how I would develop darker value shapes on dry paper. So now that that initial palest layer of purple has already dried, I can now go in and paint in darker shadow shapes over that. And of course, because I just have that palest tea consistency color painted in, I don't want to go in with a milk or cream consistency because there's going to be a very large jump from my lightest value and my very dark value that I'm painting in. So I go in with a coffee consistency over that initial palest layer to create that bridge mid-tone transition. And then after those lighter shadow shapes have dried, I can go in and develop a darker shadow shape over that with an even thicker consistency, say a milk or cream consistency. And of course, because I am painting on dry paper, my edges of my shapes are sharp and defined. So it's a completely different look from the initial wet on wet rectangle. But you can always soften the edges of your shapes as long as the paint is still wet. You can easily go in with a clean and only slightly damp brush and run your paintbrush bristles over that edge that you're looking to soften. When you're working wet on wet or wet on dry, it is very important that you allow each layer to dry completely in between your applications. Otherwise, you can very easily arrive at overworked results. But as you can see, I've developed a nice range of values in both rectangles, but the effects are completely different. One is super soft and diffused, and the other one is sharper, and it's better for detailing and more defined work. All right, everyone, and that is gonna do it for this watercolor video. I really hope that this was helpful and that you enjoyed it. If you have any comments or questions, go ahead and leave them down below in the comment section, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. I'll be linking to more helpful resources for you down below in the recommended resources, along with the tutorials that I shared in this video. Thank you so very much for joining me on this one. I wish you a wonderful rest of your day. Enjoy your art practice and see you very, very soon.